In January 1979 the killing stopped, but the silence was louder than ever. Vietnamese tanks rolled into Phnom Penh, and for the first time in nearly 4 years, the streets weren't filled with screams. The Khmer Rouge had vanished into the jungle, dragging their black uniforms and red flags with them. The survivors, the few who could still walk, emerged like ghosts from the labor camps, blinking into the light of a city that no longer felt real. There were no celebrations, no parades, just stunned silence. The nightmare should have ended, but instead a new chapter began. One that few talk about. One where the violence didn't end, it only changed its shape. The Vietnamese army installed a new government, the People's Republic of Kampuchea. They promised peace. They promised rebuilding. But to many Cambodians it wasn't liberation. It was occupation. Old Khmer Rouge defectors were suddenly wearing new uniforms. Men who once presided over death camps now sat behind desks, calling themselves ministers. There were new flags, new slogans, but the same fear. The country was shattered. 1 in every 4 Cambodians was dead. Children wandered without parents. Rice paddies were mass graves. The temples were rubble. And the people, they were hollow. Not just physically starved, but emotionally amputated. There was no time to grieve. No space to mourn. The new government didn't ask questions. It didn't hold trials. It needed control. So it did what totalitarian regimes always do. It silenced the past. Teachers were told not to talk about the genocide. Survivors were told to move on. Families who had lost everything were forced to smile for propaganda posters. And those who remembered too much? They disappeared again just like before. And still, deep in the jungle, Pol Pot was alive. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't tried. He was broadcasting radio messages from the shadows, still dreaming of revolution. And the world listened. The United Nations, the West, even China, they kept recognizing the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's official government. Why? Because the Vietnamese were now the enemy. Cold War politics had flipped the script. And once again Cambodians were caught in the middle. This wasn't peace. It was purgatory. The killing fields had gone quiet, but the country still bled, quietly, slowly, and without witnesses. The Khmer Rouge had fallen. But Cambodians were not free. They had simply traded one master for another. The Vietnamese-backed People's Republic of Kampuchea promised justice. But instead, it delivered suspicion, control, and silence. The new regime didn't purge like Pol Pot. It bled slowly, under the cover of reform. Across the country, re-education camps were set up, not for Khmer Rouge leaders but for ordinary people. Former teachers, monks, intellectuals, even villagers who had said the wrong thing. They were forced to confess sins they didn't commit, to accept guilt for surviving. Thousands were arrested without trial, tortured behind barbed wire fences. Some disappeared altogether. Justice became a performance. And while the regime hunted enemies, the people starved. Vietnam's war with China drained resources. International aid was cut off. The soil was poisoned by bones, the harvests ruined by war. Famine swept through the villages again. In some regions, people ate tree bark just to survive. Again. Just like under Pol Pot. But this time, no one called it genocide. In Phnom Penh, the slogans changed, but the fear remained. Propaganda loudspeakers echoed down empty streets. Soldiers patrolled the markets. Children were taught to report their parents. Neighbors whispered about informants. And everyone kept quiet. Then came the revenge. The new regime, once filled with Khmer Rouge defectors, turned on their former comrades. Thousands of lower-level cadres were rounded up and executed, not after trials but in hidden forests and shallow pits. The government denied it. But the bones said otherwise. And yet, the greatest violence was still to come. The Vietnamese-installed government saw ethnic Vietnamese as heroes. But much of the Cambodian population, angry, traumatized, vengeful, saw them as occupiers. And they wanted blood. So when the government lost control in rural provinces, mobs and militias took their place. Villages burned. Men were dragged from homes. Women were raped and murdered. Ethnic Vietnamese who had lived in Cambodia for generations were suddenly enemies of the state. Thousands were slaughtered. Thousands more fled. It was ethnic cleansing hiding beneath the smoke of liberation. And through it all, the Khmer Rouge regrouped. In the western jungles they rebuilt, rearmed, recruited. Sometimes they even received food and weapons from Western powers, not because they were good but because they hated Vietnam. The killing fields had not ended. They had moved. The new chains were not forged in ideology. They were built from fear, silence, and forgotten graves. In the aftermath of genocide, Cambodia should have healed. But instead, it bled into another one, quieter, targeted, and almost completely erased from memory. The victims this time were the ethnic Vietnamese. They had lived in Cambodia for generations, fishing in the Mekong, farming in the Delta, marrying into Khmer families. But in the ruins of post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia, they became scapegoats. Strangers, traitors, enemies. Across the countryside, whispers turned to hatred. Villagers blamed them for the invasion. Mobs accused them of collaboration. Old rivalries, fueled by centuries of conflict, boiled over. And then the killing began. In Kampuchea province, entire Vietnamese communities were rounded up, beaten, and executed. Some were dragged from their homes and hacked apart in rice fields. Others were pushed into rivers with stones tied to their legs. Children were not spared. Pregnant women were shot in the stomach. Babies were drowned. In some villages, not a single Vietnamese family survived. The government looked away. They called it local anger. Uncontrollable emotion. But documents and testimonies suggest otherwise. In some regions, local officials helped coordinate the massacres, or stood by while they happened. The bodies piled up in forests, wells, and ditches. No funerals. No records. No justice. In Phnom Penh, the Vietnamese embassy begged for answers. The UN issued muted statements. But the world was already turning away from Cambodia. There was no television coverage. No protests. No tribunals. Just silence. Those who survived were forced onto trucks, deported across the border into Vietnam. Some were sent in leaky boats, packed so tightly that dozens suffocated before reaching shore. Others were simply left in no man's land between two hostile countries, forgotten in the jungle. By 1985, the Vietnamese population in Cambodia had dropped by more than 90%. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands were killed or disappeared. The Khmer Krom, ethnic Cambodians living in Vietnam, were also targeted, caught in the crossfire of two governments that used identity as a weapon. This wasn't an echo of Pol Pot. It was something new. Ethnic cleansing committed in the name of nationalism, revenge, and silence. And still no one called it genocide. The killing fields had become more selective, but no less brutal. And the message was clear. In Cambodia, to be different was to be disposable. By the mid-1980s, Cambodia was no longer a battlefield. It was something worse, a place where no one trusted memory and truth came with a price. The Vietnamese-backed government called it peace. But for survivors, it was just a different kind of prison. The mass killings had slowed, but the trauma had calcified into every corner of life. Fear didn't fade, it became habit. There were still camps, still surveillance, still whispers that could get you killed. Former Khmer Rouge soldiers who had switched sides now wore government uniforms. Some even ran the new Reeducation programs. And the victims, the ones who had buried their families in shallow pits, were told to obey, told to forget, told to build statues of a peace that never came. The forests were haunted, not by spirits but by guerrillas. The Khmer Rouge had not died. They had retreated into the hills, rebranded as freedom fighters, and were now waging a bloody civil war. With secret funding from the West and support from Thailand and China, they ambushed supply lines, bombed villages, and recruited new soldiers. Many of them orphaned teenagers who didn't know who to believe. In the cities, food was still scarce. Medicine was still a rumor. Electricity flickered if it came at all. But what grew easily was suspicion. Every conversation could be betrayal. Every knock on the door might be your last. The government created a network of local committees, neighborhood watchers, informant cells, loyalty inspections. Paranoia became policy. And through it all, the ghosts lingered. Mothers searching for missing sons. Children born in labor camps, now teenagers with no history. Monks who returned to monasteries with burned scrolls and broken memories. Families who didn't speak of the past, not because they forgot but because remembering might break them. Cambodia wasn't rebuilding. It was repressing. And in that vacuum of healing, the past mutated. Survivors whispered different truths behind closed doors. Teachers skipped over entire chapters of history. Young people asked what year zero meant, and no one answered. This was not recovery. It was amnesia with a flag. Justice was just a word. Reconciliation a distant rumor. And in the shadows of burned villages and broken temples, the Khmer Rouge still whispered of return. By the late 1980s, Cambodia was quiet again. But it wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. A nation too broken to scream. Too traumatized to speak. The blood had dried, but the wounds remained open, invisible and festering. Justice never came. Pol Pot, the architect of genocide, was still alive, not hiding in fear but holding press conferences in jungle camps. He claimed to lead a resistance. He wore civilian clothes. He smiled. And the world, unbelievably, still gave him a seat at the table. 4 years after the fall of Phnom Penh, the United Nations continued to recognize the Khmer Rouge as Cambodia's legitimate government. Why? Because the new regime was backed by Vietnam, and in the Cold War playbook, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So Pol Pot became useful again. The CIA, China, and Thailand funneled weapons and supplies into the jungle. Not because they believed in his revolution, but because they wanted to weaken Vietnam. And in the middle of this geopolitical chessboard were millions of ordinary Cambodians, betrayed again. The Khmer Rouge launched new offensives, bombed schools, burned villages, and the cycle began again. Another generation born into fear. It wasn't until the 1990s, decades too late, that the world finally began to whisper the word, genocide. Tribunals were formed. Speeches were made. But by then most of the killers were old men dying in silence. Pol Pot died in 1998 in a hut, under house arrest, never tried, never punished. His final breath wasn't one of guilt. It was of sleep. And the victims? They were left to rebuild a country from ash and bones. Mass graves turned into rice fields. Torture prisons became museums. Children were raised beside skulls. Memory became an inheritance no one asked for. Today Cambodia walks with a limp. Its temples have been rebuilt, its cities modernized. But beneath the surface the trauma remains. A whole generation raised by silence. Some too afraid to speak. Others too young to understand. The second genocide was never given a name. It left no monuments, no global outrage. It was quieter, crueler, hidden behind slogans and diplomacy. But the bones still rise after the rain. The ghosts still speak through the silence. And the past waits. Because if history taught us anything, it's this. Genocide doesn't need fire to burn a nation, just silence.